You want me to start?
Welcome to the Entrepreneurial Hour, where we have Dan Frye making a special presentation on the topic of, Dan?
Exploiting business and technology.
Exploiting business and technology. Thank you. Dan, the floor is yours.
All right. I assume everybody can see the presentation. Yeah. Okay. So a couple disclaimers before we get started. First of all, information security is not a binary issue. So if you have a security issue or your clients have a security issue, then don't say, Dan once said in a presentation, and so I did X. Second, so we'll touch on some legal issues. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not very good at law stuff. There's a reason for that. So any sort of legal stuff, again, don't say Dan once said in a presentation. Call a lawyer, get real legal advice. So there's two things I kind of want everybody to take away from the presentation. The first is the cyber world, and what we kind of term cyber, is created by the decisions that businesses make to leverage technology. If computers never advanced beyond, breaking codes during World War II, then we wouldn't have a cyber world, right? There wouldn't be hacking, there wouldn't be technology in the way that we use it today. So, when someone starts talking about cyber, I think inadvertently, a lot of people link that immediately with internet security or digital privacy, right? Where it's like, oh, it's all about cyber. It's not really. Cyber is a different type of world, an abstract world that we create just by doing business. Now, what cyber really is underneath the covers is really a revolutionary struggle for power. So if you think back to late 1940s, or even go back to like the 1900s, right? We as a nation influenced other nations and nation building, right? Even if you go back before that, right? You had the British Empire, you had everything that happened in feudal Europe. It was all about a struggle for power with adversaries. Now, what cyber, all of these business decisions and the technology that we're leveraging, is actually created almost an abstract world where it has rebalanced the playing field, right? You don't need a fleet of warships to get your way. And we'll kind of talk through some of those examples. So the thing to remember is that cyber is not about security. It's about a leverage of power in a new type of medium. So kind of the format that we'll go through is, I laid this out into a PESTEL framework. So political, economic, sociological, technical, or technological, economic, and legal are kind of the different issues that we'll kind of walk through and give you kind of a round sense of what cyber really means. So the first one, you guys all voted, I assume. So, back in 2017, we had this big thing about, Russia hacking the US election process, right? They hacked, the Democratic National Convention. They influenced, Facebook and some of the different advertising types that different constituencies saw, right? But is that really any different than the US influencing elections in, let's say, South America in the 1980s? Or is it any different than McCarthy era politics in the United States when there was a feared surge of communism, right? That was pre-computer. But it doesn't really change the way that we influence or try to influence political power. It's just a new type of medium to do it. Critical infrastructure. So one of the big fears about this cyber world, right, is that we are heavily reliant on connected infrastructure. So the Ukraine was actually the first real hack of a power grid. It was right before Christmas. And obviously Ukraine in the winter is very cold and they rely on electricity to put heat into homes. So a guy sitting at a control panel right before Christmas and he sees the mouse move across the screen and starts shutting down substations. Tries to move his mouse to take control and he had no control of the system. So they were in the power grid just shutting stuff off. Thankfully, the Ukrainian power grid is actually really pretty old and they actually have a manual override. So they send dudes out to all these substations and just flip the breakers back on manually, right? And just basically cut off the system. So they were recovered in about 6 hours. But what was kind of fascinating about that is it took them 6 months to get actually fully recovered. And in those 6 months, you basically had manual override that they were relying on to turn power. Now, fast forward to the United States. So we get more and more and more connected. The United States power grid doesn't have manual override in a lot of cases. So could a nation state hack severely disrupt the power grid and thereby the economy of the United States or another connected environment? The answer is absolutely yes. So there's this new type of lever where it's like, I don't need to bomb a power station to disrupt an economy. I can kind of turn it on and off at will. So far, nations have been pretty resistant to flipping those and using that kind of power, right? Then that's kind of mutually assured destruction. So if I disrupt the economy in the United States, that's going to have a trickle down effect to the economy in China and Russia who buy oil, right? So the saving grace of the cyber world, and the reason that we don't have more cyber incidents, or at least it's held at a reasonable level, is because it's almost, there's an economic backstop to it. And I think a lot of the people in power can understand that. Mostly. So here's the rub. If you have a smaller adversary that doesn't have that same type of power, you can do some really fascinating things. So, details came out about Stuxnet over the last 7-8 years, and it's kind of fascinating that they were able to work with Siemens to find controller software errors that were so subtle that they were able to essentially speed up and slow down the centrifuges inside of a nuclear power plant. Nuclear power plant is fully disconnected. So there was a spy, that went in and plugged in a USB drive that infected these Windows machines and had the exact code that was necessary to not change the Windows machine, but to actually infect the programmable logic controllers that were spinning these centrifuges. And they did it in such a way that they destroyed the most precious resource that Iran had, which was the actual uranium that they were trying to convert into the nuclear fissionable material. So this is super high level stuff, right? You get a kid in your basement, like he's like, man, I'm just going to crash a bunch of Windows computers, but that doesn't really stop a nuclear program. So, it very quickly became, okay, it was definitely a nation state who did it. And they had filtered out so much of the code that there was really no clues in it, except they did find one word that was linked back to potentially Israel. And so if Israel is doing it, and Siemens is a US-based company, more than likely the United States was somewhat involved. But again, never proved, never really brought to the forefront. What does this say about cyber warfare? Basically, it shows a couple things. One, it's cheap to acquire. It's very difficult to attribute, and it's increasingly effective. And that is whether you're talking about SCADA systems and power grids, whether you're talking about nuclear centrifuges, or any of the other things that are hyper-connected. But because it is so cheap to acquire, and because it is so difficult to attribute, it sets the stage for kind of a David versus Goliath scenario. And that's exactly what we saw in 2011, 2012. So US has stealth drones, shocker. We were flying one of those over Iran, again, shocker. Iran figured out how to jam the GPS frequency, or so they claim, on the stealth drone and convinced it to land at a Iranian airfield. They thought it was landing in Texas instead it was in Iran. What they had said is that there's two channels for GPS. One is an encrypted military channel, and then there is a public channel, because all GPS is run by the United States military, that is clear text. So if you jam the military frequency, the failback, like any good software engineer, says, oh, I can't just have the thing flying around. I'll just go to the unencrypted channel. So jam the encrypted one, spoof the unencrypted channel, feed it different coordinates, and then it thinks that it's somewhere else and it lands. However, the United States military said, well, our drones and our aircraft don't use GPS exactly because of that flaw. We use inertial navigation systems, INS. INS can't be spoofed. So what we do know is that a stealth drone landed in an Iranian airfield. So did it use INS, or was it relied on GPS? Or was there a software engineering programmer error that, I don't know. Nobody really knows exactly why it landed. So what was fascinating about this particular incident is this thing happens in 2011. US denies that it ever happens until 2014, when Obama asked very nicely, could we please have our stealth drone back? And then of course, everybody goes crazy. Iran responds with, I'm sorry, but we've already given the drone to Iran or to Russia and China so that they can copy it. So you have this technology platform that is significantly advanced in terms of stealth reconnaissance capabilities that the US is probably one of only a few nations that could really develop something of that scale. And by a very simple hack with a couple of radio transmitters and probably a few $1,000s worth of gear, they're able to take. So billions of dollars has been diverted into enemy hands. So it's kind of fascinating that these are the types of issues that we will continue to see, right? Where it's much smaller adversary fighting a totally different type of engagement against the United States military. So let's talk about economic factors. So this was kind of fascinating. Now, bear in mind, I put this together in 2017, so some of the numbers you're going to see are much older. For example, Apple and Microsoft weren't trillion-dollar companies then. Global business losses from cybercrime are expected to reach $6 trillion by 2021, which is number one, the largest transfer of wealth in history. And number two, it's actually more profitable than the illegal drug trade worldwide. So, I mean, think of all the drugs that are sold worldwide, cybercrime, way better. So when you think about all the hacks that happen now, right, it's kind of elementary. It's like, all right, our target market is way bigger over here and it's way easier to do. And it's much simpler and it's very difficult to attribute. So why don't I go do cybercrime rather than trying to grow drugs? I mean, it's elementary, right? I'm a businessman. I'm going to go where the money is. So to put that kind of into perspective, to 6 trillion is just some random large number. So this was the market cap of companies at the end of 2017, so a couple of years ago. Basically, the amount of cybercrime is Microsoft, Facebook, Berkshire Hathaway, Google, Amazon, Visa, Oracle, Intel, AT&T, Bank of America, Toyota, and Apple, all combined. Like, if you took all of those companies, merged them together, right, you would say, hey, that's a massive monopoly worldwide power. And that's essentially what cybercrime is, an organized cybercrime. So think about it, don't think about it, cybercrime is like some criminal sitting in a basement. It's not. It's highly organized people that are making massively outsized profits on the work that we're doing. So then you've got just overall, economic impacts from events that happen in the world. So Maersk, you guys have heard about ransomware, I'm positive. Yeah. So Maersk had a huge ransomware attack. 90% of the world's shipping is done at sea. And Maersk accounts for about 18% of that. So they get this malware in their system, basically shuts down everything. So $300 million loss. In terms of total dollar value to Maersk, $300 million is not that much. They're a fairly large company. However, the amount of downstream impact to suppliers and consumers is pretty massive. I mean, remember when the Suez Canal got blocked by the Evergiven, right? Disrupted supply chain. We're coming out of the pandemic now. Supply chain is all sorts of wonky. What would happen if you had a significantly massive attack across different shipping channels now, right? Worldwide disruption. It would take a couple people in a basement with some laptops to make that happen. I mean, that's the balance of power, right? So when we talk about, like, the cybersecurity industry and everybody throwing money at it, there is a massive fear around people that just want to watch the world burn. And that's really what we're kind of talking about in terms of organized cybercrime. Bug bounties. So on the flip side of that, there are ways to make money on this stuff. So back in 2017, 2018, Google and Microsoft started offering money. If you found a bug, we'll pay it. And this was a way to get security researchers to really focus on improving the product. Companies were actually building whole models around actually finding bugs and allowing, it's like PayPal for bugs, basically. I mean, or eBay for bugs. BugCrowd, HackerOne, Synac, I mean, they all took on significant investment. I mean, 20 million, 74 million, 55 million in Series A rounds, and that was back in 2017. So sociocultural factors. Hacking is cool. So you had Mr. Robot, was a great show. The fascinating thing about Mr. Robot is that all the hacks that they did were actually legitimate hacks. It wasn't like Hollywoodized, like, let's hack the firewall, boom, we're in. I mean, this was like they had a security consultant that would come in and like actually set up the hack on the devices, and they would execute the hack in real time. There's a scene in the second Matrix where they use an open SSH vulnerability to hack into something, and Trinity goes and does something with Neo, whatever. That was also another good example of where they had actually researched, like, yeah, that's a legit SCADA attack on SSH. So because hacking is cool, you get more people that are drawn to it. Most aren't going to do anything crazy. And it heightens the awareness or the understanding of exactly what cybercrime and cybersecurity is, which is great from a recruiting standpoint. Because one of the challenges that we have in cybersecurity is a lack of talented people. Then you have the flip side of that coin. You've got Anonymous, right? So Anonymous is basically a hacktivist organization. They kind of view themselves as the white knights of the digital realm, right? So they're kind of there to enforce what they feel is some moral obligation around the use of technology, and kind of what they say goes. That is both good and evil. There was an interesting story several years ago that one of the campaign strategies for the Obama administration was to avoid antagonizing the Anonymous organization. And the reason why is they didn't feel that they could adequately protect their systems during the re-election campaign from hackers. So what do? You just don't piss off the hackers, and they'll kind of leave you alone. So kind of fascinating, right? They've been relatively quiet the last few years. They kind of had a surge, and then they've kind of faded out. But again, you just need that one little tinderbox to get them to reconstitute. But one thing that is kind of fascinating about that, right, is that you have President of the United States is adapting strategy to avoid a collective group of hackers. I mean, the balance of power there, right, is a massive shift. So let's talk about businesses, because we're kind of part of the problem. So Internet of Things. You guys all know IoT, and everything's being connected. Cars, planes, trains, automobiles, whatever. This is kind of a graph of kind of the expected growth and the prior growth over the last 20 or so years. And it's amazing how many devices that we're adding, just at an exponential rate. There was a talk I gave many, many years ago about internet connected toothbrushes. It's like you put an app on your phone, and so there's a computer in the toothbrush. So theoretically, the computing power is small, but could you technically use a toothbrush to hack something big? Absolutely, it'll execute code. So it was kind of fascinating to say, could you hack the world with a toothbrush? It was a fun talk, but. In business terms, business looks at it like this: life moves really fast. We have to keep up. But if you don't stop and look around and say, hey, wait a minute, maybe this isn't secure, right? Going back to the drone thing, right? Exactly what navigation system was that thing using? Or connected cars. TransHalo, I think you guys know Laura. She's working in this kind of field, right? Where it's like car safety, car security is not the top of mind. It's about, how do I build a lower price car, charge more for it, and increase my margins, because the car industry is a really difficult industry to be in. So security kind of comes last. Going to the startup world, right? My goal is to build a minimally viable product as fast as humanly possible. Security stuff, we'll get to that when we get a whole bunch of paying customers, we go back and fix it, but you never really do. So it's kind of a fascinating process that security always kind of comes last in that value chain. A really good business figures out how to integrate that into the process of building software. Which leads me to my next point: prioritizing short and long-term objectives. So, enterprises in particular, because of the way that they function as just these kind of plotting massive behemoths, they have a very short, finite view of the world, which is generally the next earnings report. So prioritize earnings, prioritize customers. But some of those can come back and bite you. So ecological factors. So World War II, there was an operation called Operation Chastise. They flew 19 bombers over Germany. They dropped a bunch of bombs. They killed 1,600 civilians, but they destroyed a couple dams. It took 6 months to restore power to that particular manufacturing region. These are all the dams in the United States. The red dots indicate where significant loss of life would happen if a dam failed or a control system failed. The rest of them, varying degrees of not so good, and probably doesn't matter too much, but the dam getting damage is probably fairly significant. So this is Operation Chastise today. It's a personal laptop. I don't need a fleet of bombers. I don't need to project power across the world. I basically just need to get on a laptop and on the internet. So again, a massive redistribution of power comparative to the way that we used to conduct large-scale operations. So legal factors. Everybody's read about Snowden. Everybody's probably seen the movie about Snowden. This had a massive impact in terms of politics and the way the U.S. conducted its operations abroad. There was one of the issues that I dealt with was we had the Patriot Act. Canada would not allow trans-border data flows into the U.S. So the company that I worked for was in India, Canada, and the U.S. So we had customers in Canada that we had to move data to the U.S., but all of a sudden we couldn't. That became a massive problem as an output of one person basically redistributing stuff by basically stealing data. So I wouldn't necessarily say it's a hack, but it's certainly in the realm of cybersecurity and cyber issue. Max Schrems, this is always one of my favorites. This guy was a law student, wasn't even quite a lawyer yet. His theory was that if the US government has access to my data as an EU citizen, then there's not adequate protection for trans-border data flows. And kind of what it looks like is this. You've got Facebook that's sitting over in Ireland, and it needs to pump data to the US parent organization. A Irish user relies on something called the Safe Harbor decision, which basically says the US would support EU privacy law. The EU privacy law is very strict. Basically, anything that can be used to identify a person is considered protected data. In the US, we have a much looser policy. It's basically social security number, name, address, and account number in combination. So two varying degrees of definition of what personal information is. So the Safe Harbor decision was supposed to create somewhat of a level playing field, maybe a funnel is the best way to picture it. And so this guy said, well, wait a minute, if the US government has access to my data, then they're not really meeting their obligations. And he took it to the court in Ireland, and Ireland said, yeah, you're right. So all of a sudden, all the trans-border data flows between Europe and the United States torn up. And then it's like, okay, well, we need to do something else. So they put in something called Privacy Shield a couple of years later. And in the meantime, everybody's kind of throwing their hands up in the air, like, what do we do? Because business can't stop. So then they got Privacy Shield passed. And then what did Max Schrems do again? Tore it down, same problem. Because the government still had access to the data. So you're never going to get around the ability for the United States government to issue a subpoena or warrant to acquire data about a particular user, regardless of wherever that user is. So, I mean, it's no different than China, right? China walks into something, it's very authoritarian, centralized control. At least they don't make excuses for it. They just say, yeah, this is just the way, this is how we're going to do things. So it's rather fascinating that the legal implications of the way that data flows in transnational cyber world doesn't necessarily always match reality or what we expect reality to be. And the fact that it can be challenged by basically a law student and have massive implications across a whole host of countries and companies is fairly significant. And then you've got data breaches, right? So everybody was around when Equifax got hacked. Basically half of America had their data stolen. And this just goes back to the point that, when we started social security numbers way back in the day, the idea was not to have a identifier that's used across a bunch of connected systems. It was basically a way for the government to put a serial number of a person and track them throughout their life. So we are using antiquated mechanisms for data that they were never intended to be used for. So the problem, one of the problems with cybersecurity is not necessarily that you've got data breaches. It's the way that we're using the data that creates an insecurity. So if we didn't rely on social security numbers, would it really matter if they were stolen? No. If you had your house keys lost, right, or stolen, what do? You just change the locks on your doors. Well, we don't have a mechanism to do that. There is no way to effectively go back and change your social security number or re-encrypt your social security number or re-tokenize it. So there's these antiquated processes that we haven't quite fully adapted into the cyber world, and we don't really know how to deal with it. And that creates opportunities for thieves to steal stuff. So right after the Equifax thing happened, one of the big questions that kind of hit the cybersecurity industry was, well, do we need a U.S. federal law? There's a couple problems with that. First, the judiciary system effectively is block litigation because it sets a really high standard for plaintiffs to be able to prove that they were harmed. So how do I know that because my data was hacked from Equifax, that's why I'm getting these, spam calls, or because it was from Equifax that they opened a line of credit? You don't. It could have been stolen from somewhere else, and so much of it has been stolen that it's almost impossible to prove. There was a couple stories several years ago. One of the effective ways to get restitution was actually to file a small claims court case, because generally small claims, I think it's like 10 grand, 15 grand max. And the balance of burden of proof shifts in a small claims court case versus a standard lawsuit. So it was relatively interesting to kind of watch that bounce around. Federal Trade Commission doesn't have rulemaking authority, and there aren't security standards for private companies. So, the president can issue executive directives. You can have industry groups that, like PCI for payment card industry, can issue things, but there's not a centralized body that can really enforce cybersecurity policy down. The other problem is that the U.S. federal government kind of dragged their feet on a data breach law. So the state said, okay, we're just going to go make our own, and pretty much every state has a data breach law. There are a couple that drag their feet forever, and the irony was, and this was something we used to talk about back when I was CISO, it was theoretically, I'm not under legal obligation to notify people in that state that their data has been breached. However, it cost me more money to not notify them than just to go ahead and notify them, because there were so many others that I had to notify. So you just throw them into the same mix and it's all automated. So one of the big challenges was, does the federal law preempt the state laws? Because the state laws are all slightly different in terms of private right of action and requirement to notify. And so no one really wanted to tackle that. There was no way to really preempt what had already been put into place. The other thing I would argue is, do criminal laws actually do anything to aid enforcement? I mean, like, everybody knows hacking is illegal, right? I think it was 1984 Fraud and Abuse Act for computers. Okay, so we got a law that says it's illegal to hack, but does it stop anything? No. Would additional obligations on business motivate them to improve their security? Maybe, but that's just kind of exacerbating the problem even more, because we don't have enough people to actually go back and secure it. So you're forcing companies to do something that they just can't do. What's the impact on the overall economy and output of a company if they have to divert some percentage, almost as a tax, to secure their systems? Does it really make it effective? No. So those are some of the larger problems that are created through this idea of the federal data breach. There's some changes that have been made as an output of Equifax that I really agree with, around freezing credit by default. Something that I didn't realize when I was originally making this presentation a couple of years ago was, you have a kid, the kid's credit by default is unlocked. And so they get older and older and older. That is another number that can be stolen. But why does a 5-year-old need the ability to open a line of credit? They don't. So why is that not locked automatically? And there's a number of bills that change that and change a little bit of the banking industry. So to kind of wrap it all up, I found this quote when I was doing research originally, and I really liked it because I think it really sums up exactly what we're talking about. Cybersecurity is perhaps most interesting because of what it reveals about power. Technology weaves a complex and often contradictory web of power relations between citizens, government, and the private sphere. And those relations are incredibly dynamic, which we've seen over the last few years. As we continue to make headway in technological innovation, businesses are vested with a significant amount of power, and so are people. They have the potential to do a massive amount of good. I mean, you think back to what we do with, Google and phones and mobile devices, the ability to access information and data is massively increased. But with that opportunity also comes the ability for it to be abused. And there are people that will always fall on both sides of the coin. So that is really kind of the crux of what cyber really is. It's balance of good versus evil, of struggle and rebalance power in a way that we just have never seen. So that's it.
Well,
Any
great.
questions?
That was a great presentation.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I have one question that's more theoretical. When power, control, and cybersecurity, the effectiveness, or shall we say the value of cybersecurity is really related to the amount of power that a breach will give the person creating the breach.
Yeah.
So the content of the data or the device that it controls is really what creates the enticement for the cybersecurity, right? Is that right?
Correct. Yeah.
So the value is really directed by how much power you can actually.
Correct.
All right. So
Yes.
hence ransomware, the higher the ransom, for the higher the power that you've just been able to access.
Yeah, but so the interesting thing about ransomware, we saw this with the Colonial Pipeline Act.
Right.
There's a certain thing about it in terms of a business. There's a certain amount of badness that I need to do to maintain my profit margin. But there is a upper limit of badness where I get a whole lot of attention that I don't really want. Hacking into America is very sensitive about oil. When you start screwing with the oil delivery system, you get a lot of attention at the nation state level that you wouldn't get when you're hacking, the lawyer down the street. And when you exceed that level of badness, that's where you got to kind of wind things back. And we saw that with the Colonial Pipeline issue, right? And we've seen that a couple times since, where the U.S. government has effectively said, "Hey, wait a minute, this is getting a little bit out of control." They are happy to say, "Yeah, there's a certain finite amount of waste that will occur, and a certain amount of profit that these guys are going to generate. We're okay with that." That's just undertow from digital society.
Mhm.
But when it threatens a much larger, broader base of economic output, that's really where you start to see it.
Yeah, because if you think about it, FedEx had the same type of lock. What do you call them? I forget. That's too early.
Ransomware.
Yeah, ransomware. They got hit by ransomware, and almost 90% of their PCs and servers were encrypted.
Yeah.
So nobody really cared.
Yeah.
But yet the oil. So that's a prime example. Two major companies, the exact same thing happens to them. And FedEx didn't even pay the ransom.
Yeah. No
They just went out and bought all the PCs.
Yeah. Saudi Aramco had 20,000 machines encrypted a few years ago. Saudi Aramco is a fairly large company.
Yeah.
But it didn't affect U.S. oil delivery, so nobody cared.
Wally has two big paragraphs that I'm not even going to attempt to read.
Yeah, sorry about that. Too long, didn't read. No, I just had a comment on Stuxnet. Years leading up to the actual release of that particular event, the U.S. did a lot of preparation. I was part of a group that went to Las Vegas. They brought CISOs in for a very large meeting to convince them that, hey, you have Siemens gear, either controlling your buildings or your technology. We got briefed on very specific vulnerabilities, how to remediate, and an urgency to do it. And again, there were some follow-up activities as well. So this, whether you think we were involved or not, it does show that, anytime there's a lot of preparation, we either have a lot of inside information that somebody's going to do something offensive, and it's a good idea to listen to that. Similar to how gas masks were distributed, say, in the World War I, World War II eras, just to regular citizens, there was some concern. So that's the kind of thing that I think we all have to be aware of.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Yeah. The other thing is, all companies have cybersecurity components. A challenge I've seen is the CISOs typically report to the CIO, and that leaves an imbalance there on, risk acceptance, where the CIO is more likely to go with the business. And I've definitely seen it. When I worked at SunTrust, the CIO was on the board. We didn't have a named CISO. One person acted in it on a regulatory stance, and I did it on the technology. But if a line of business wanted a new technology, they didn't care how vulnerable it was. If it's generating revenue, that was part of their risk acceptance. And Yeah, we just don't see many CISOs actually being board members or having the influence with board members. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so it's an interesting thing, is it's somewhat of a hot button for me. So for the beginning part of my CISO career, I reported up to what was effectively the CIO. And there was always a push-pull of getting stuff done, just in terms of remediating vulnerabilities or securing systems or whatever. At some point, after a couple of years, my reporting structure changed, and I reported up through the chief legal officer of the organization. And it was a much, much better fit. And the reason why is that the chief legal officer, in their capacity as a lawyer, is essentially there to guide the company in terms of liability. So when you go and talk to, a legal officer or the board, then you can make the statement, we've signed a contract to do X. Here's the possible liability from not executing that contract in terms of cybersecurity obligations. All of a sudden you get a whole lot of attention and you get a whole lot of support to get things done. But you would never get that perspective and that visibility unless you had more direct exposure to the legal apparatus of the organization. So I think that was probably the primary benefit of that reporting structure. You can get visibility on the tech stack fairly easy, just with ordinary security tools. But it's that legal component and the liability component, I think, that's really, truly valuable in driving organizational change. I think the other.
Yeah, that's a good point. Equifax, they were actually, their cybersecurity reported to legal, and then they changed to the CIO. So I think they learned a hard lesson there.
Well, and I think it's something where you have to have a relationship in both camps. It can't be one or the other. I think the other thing that's somewhat interesting about the legal reporting relationship is it facilitates certain communications to be better protected from legal process. If I'm sitting in my, general counsel's office and we're talking about security vulnerabilities and security output, some of that is naturally protected because it's essentially a legal conversation, right? Versus two employees trading emails about overall cybersecurity status and whatnot, right, that are discoverable. So there's something to be said for trying to protect some of that. Now, if you had a big enough breach, is it probably going to be discoverable? Maybe, who knows? I mean, it's a legal thing. I'm not a lawyer, but there certainly is some value in having some of that protected, or at least to be protected in certain instances.
All right, great comments. Appreciate the presentation.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
So,
Tom.
I was going to say, Tom.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, Dan, I really enjoyed it. Let me go back and use an analogy here, quality. If you go back, and I was at Motorola for many years, back pre-Six Sigma, Motorola had a rule that if a product had more than 2% per month failures, okay, that was deemed unacceptable. Okay, and then Six Sigma came about. And we all know the history of Six Sigma, or most of you I'm sure do. But what happened, it wasn't taking root in Motorola until Bob Galvin, the chairman, said, what we're going to do, when we have operations reviews of the major elements, which he attended, he said, we'll have the operations review and a quality review. And there never was enough time for the quality reviews. So Galvin, I was at the meeting when he did this, he said, stop. From now on, we're going to do quality reviews first, and then we'll do operations reviews. We were all shocked. But what happened is he made quality more important than operations review profitability, like that. It spread through the organization like wildfire, and it changed the entire culture of the company. Okay, and so when I lecture about quality and talk about this stuff, I say the mark of a failed quality program in a company is a large quality organization. Until you build quality into the fabric of everybody's job, nobody takes it seriously. I think cybersecurity is just happens to be 30 to 40 years later than that thing. So I think cybersecurity, until it becomes so important as an operational aspect throughout the entire company, I mean, secretaries at Motorola, there weren't such things at the time, thought about quality. Okay, so you can't dictate cybersecurity. It's got to become part of the fabric. And I think that's where the real push has to be. So instead of talking to CIOs, what you have to do is talk to CEOs and get them to be true believers at the costs of poor cybersecurity. What we called it was, and I'm just going to stop here, the quality or the cost of non-conformance. Okay,
Yeah.
not how much it costs you for quality, the cost when something bad happens. So I think the whole world is have to go through the new revelation that cybersecurity has got to be part of the fabric, not as an add-on or department. So I'll stop.
And no, Tom, you're absolutely right. There was a really famous memo, Bill Gates memo back, I think it was around 2005. Leading up to 2005, you had all these viruses and worms that were coming out and hitting IIS servers. And Microsoft kind of got a really bad rap. Everybody was like, oh, I'm just going to use Linux servers because they're more secure. They may or may not be more secure, but at the time, the way that Microsoft was perceived was this massively insecure, very clunky stuff. And Bill Gates recognized that as a threat to the overall business. And he wrote a really famous memo that basically said, look, we are going to stop everything we're building. We're going to go back and fix all the vulnerabilities that we can. And they had a massive shift. So, like the Windows update thing, the quarterly patch cycle, the monthly patches and stuff that we see now, all of that originated back in 2005. He said, how does a person, an ordinary person, get new versions of our software? You go buy Windows 98 after you got done using Windows 95, you probably never apply a patch. So, he said patching is not just for businesses, it's for every computer user. And so they put a lot of effort into redesigning the Windows update process, to going back and fixing bugs. It was a radical shift in terms of Microsoft's thinking. And Tom, you're absolutely right. Until you have that sort of line in the sand that's drawn by the person that's in charge of the organization, then you will continue to see these kind of issues. Now, did Microsoft fix every bug? No. I mean, there are always going to be bugs in it, but it's much more about having that as part of the integral DNA of the organization.
Right.
That was the real threat that he was trying to solve.
Okay.
So my question for you is, with what is it, GDPR?
Yep, GDPR,
and CCPA?
CCPA. Yeah.
So those have been around now for about 3 or 4 years. GDPR is a year older, 2 years
Yeah,
older.
about that.
Are they doing any good? Really and truthfully?
No.
And that's why we haven't moved forward with a national one as well.
Yeah, the GDPR, I would say, is actually doing more harm than good, because it's really disrupting innovation. So a couple of years ago, when I was down at Tech doing my master's degree, I went and met with a guy named Peter Swire. He was one of the guys that actually wrote Privacy Shield after the Safe Harbor stuff. So very, very well educated about privacy stuff over in Europe. I remember having lunch with him, and we were kind of talking about just Europe in general. And one of the comments that he made was, Europe, through like a GDPR type law, effectively prevents data flows. And when you can't gather data about people, you're stunting the growth of startups. And that was pretty relevant, many years ago, where it was about advertising revenue. That was kind of the business model a lot of companies were starting out. So it really slows down the number of startups that can really start, and that leads to much slower growth rate in terms of technology progress. And I don't think they've really solved that. And from a security standpoint, does it really matter that we know that there's a guy with brown hair, blue eyes, that's 5 feet tall, that lives on a certain block? Right? Is that really valuable? But there is a historical bias output of World War II about personal data.
But I want to go back to where you talked about the politics and how, like, the grid's going down. It would be an active war type situation.
Yeah.
And you said that, for another country, except for, I'm talking about the superpowers, US, Russia, China, etc. Do you think that the statement of, well, this would start an all-out war, a preemptive strike against us, if they really wanted to do it regardless of their economy,
Yep.
would cripple us? I mean, if you took out the power grid, just-in-time inventory would fail as well.
Yeah.
All your gas stations wouldn't be able to get cars.
Right.
You would cause immediate chaos and you would cripple us.
Yes.
Forget the economy, because China, you're going to survive. You may take a hit.
Yeah.
But you could have us within, so why are we so lackadaisical about our power grids and the
I-
infrastructure in general?
I think it's not a crisis until it happens. It's you can say, look, we've got to be
Mute. Well, that's a way to mute.
I think it's one of those things. It's not a problem until it's a problem. It's you can talk about so you can talk about any sort of issue right up to the point that it happens. And then once it happens, it's like, holy crap, all right, that really happened. Now we got to do something. I mean, it's like pandemic, right?
Right.
They had. It's not like we never thought, oh, there could be a pandemic. We had Spanish flu in 1908. So it's not like it's unprecedented.
It's almost, I mean, there was an incident in 1991 where Wright-Patterson Air Force Base ended up showing up at University of Dayton computer lab.
Yeah.
And they had the MPs, they had the colonels, they had everybody there. It never went, picked up by the press. It was kept quiet, but the response was next day.
Yeah, I mean, I've been called by the FBI before. That was an interesting experience.
Yeah, it is.
And they're like, hey, do you have this IP address? Yes. Is this your server? Yes.
Yeah.
Why are you trying to hack Los Alamos National Laboratory?
And I've had that too. I've had that too
So-
I've had to answer for clients too.
Yeah.
But it's one of those things where businesses seem to say, okay, well, our risk level is this. And can we accept this risk level? Equifax survived,
Oh, I'd say they thrived.
and they
Most
thrived
right.
after it because they created more programs that people paid for to keep their data safe.
Yeah, if there's one thing I will say is that the capacity of business always trumps the ability of cybersecurity. Go back and look at like TJ Maxx after they had their data breach, right? They had to pay a penalty and whatever. The way that they got around it is let us apologize to you for breaching your data by giving you a $10 gift card to TJ Maxx. So what do? You go into TJ Maxx to spend your $10 gift card, but there's nothing in TJ Maxx you can buy for $10. Everything's $15. So you're actually generating additional revenue that you wouldn't have ordinarily captured. You're bringing in a whole bunch of people to your stores. There is a great opportunity when you see a very large breach. Wait a day or two, buy the stock, and about a quarter later, it'll be back where it was before.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, I made a decent trade on Equifax after it kind of bottomed out, and it was like, all right, give it 3 months, 4 months. I'll make a couple extra grand.
Well, that's like Ford and Bridgestone back in the day when the Bridgestone tires started blowing out.
Yeah.
Both of those two stocks. And that was in 99, 2000.
Yes.
Yeah, both of those stocks went flying down.
Yeah.
And then within 3 months, they were
Yeah,
back
right
to their
back.
level because of bad price.
I mean, Target, same thing.
Yeah.
So business will always trump security because it's the dollars that make the world go around. So I think a good CISO, a good security leader, understands the business, because your job is to secure revenues for the business. That's it. It's not about.
If I can make another comment, let me tell you, again, going back to Motorola, how they solved that problem. Nobody could talk about reliability or uptime or availability. The whole conversations became one of unavailability, downtime. So instead of talking about 99.9, we would talk about 99.99, 8 minutes of outage a year. Well, what does that mean? So charts we had, and I used to use them all the time, showed, for example, the number of surgical death or wrong surgeries per year, the number of wrong prescriptions per year. And we did in terms of deaths, okay? And so what happens is all of a sudden, when you start focusing on those numbers, as a percentage, they're very small, but it changes your thinking. So instead of talking about profitability, it's the cost of non-performance. For example, $300 million, the number in that one case, compared to the billions of revenue, is lost. But you say, this cost us $300 million. How many people could we afford to hire to offset that cost? So you change the discussion to unavailability, if you will, rather than availability. And the same thing with cybersecurity. The cost for non-conformance has got to be the CEO's leading indicator that they talk about. And that'll filter through the business. When people first start saying, what is your cost for non-conformance versus what's your EBITDA or what's your profit, like that, you'll change the business leaders, the managers' perspective. But that's what it's going to take is that type of focus on not the percentage, but on the actual absolute dollars or events that have taken place. So.
Yeah, no, Tom, you're absolutely right. Absolutely right.
So Dan, one of the main challenge, which I personally feel is regarding the lack of resources in cybersecurity space. So I met with one of my friends, he worked with Ericsson, and he was working on the T-Mobile account, and T-Mobile also recently got hacked.
Yeah.
And they fired all their cybersecurity experts the next day or within a month, and they hired a fresh batch of cybersecurity personnel. And a lot of people are not highly qualified, and not properly qualified to become a cybersecurity professional. So now they are more vulnerable than previous. So my question to you, Dan, as you are in the same industry, what do you think, like how we can solve this problem? Because what's happening, people who are experienced or who are knowledgeable, they're asking premium.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of clients are not able to pay them. So what they're doing, they're going with the second-rate consultants or employees who are not properly trained. And that is also one of the challenge which I personally feel is that is one of the reasons why these have become more vulnerable. So do you think, is it something to resolve on?
So 100%. The hiring in cybersecurity is rather fascinating. You've got some guys that have been in cybersecurity for a long time. They were guys like Mike and I, right? The tinkerers, the IT guys. And then we were like, this hacking thing is kind of cool, right? Like, dude, I'm gonna go do that. Like, this is cool. And so that was what drove you into it. And I would say that's kind of like the old guard of cybersecurity, right? Because they come from an IT background. They were practitioners before they were security. And then you've got a kind of a second wave, and these are the guys and girls that are coming out of school with a 4-year degree in cyber. They probably have some computer experience, but they've never really done operations.
Right.
And they go into it, but they understand it, but at the same time they lack the contextual understanding that you get from being an IT practitioner for a long time. And I would say that now that we're seeing almost a third wave of people, and these are people that have certain talents that align with needs in cybersecurity. Businesses, small, medium-sized businesses that don't have hundreds of $1 millions to throw at cyber are the ones that are picking up this kind of third wave of people because they can't find other people. The resources are too expensive. These are people that used to be accountants. And they said, well, I want to change careers. I don't really like being an accountant. The cyber thing sounds interesting. It's the people that, are fixing laptops at Best Buy, right? Geek Squad. They're like, I kind of know computers. I can do cyber, right? Like I know what antivirus is. What's fascinating about that is if you can find a very good leader that can grow talent, then you can build a phenomenal team. I'll pat myself on the back a little bit. One of the best teams that I ever built was people like that. I hired a guy who was an accountant. He was used to seeing very detailed spreadsheets, right? Numbers, that's what accounting was about, right? So very detailed. I threw him in front of our incident response screens. And I basically said, as these things come up, I want you to go investigate them. Because he was very, very focused on details, a very detail-oriented person. So I took that talent and I leveraged him to essentially he became one of the best investigators that I had on the team. Because I knew I could give him an alert or something and say, hey, go chase this down. He would go chase it down because he would see detail that ordinary people would miss. Just really small things. It's like the bite size on a packet is 1 hex off. Hey, wait a minute, why is this 1 hex off? Like, that's weird. And then he would chase that bit pattern down and go look at it across, another set of packet captures and be like, yeah, this traffic is actually malicious, and here's what they're trying to do. But the clue was 1 hex decimal off, right? So it's something that an ordinary person is not going to see. I hired a guy from Geek Squad. I use that example specifically. He was really, really good at problem solving because he had basically worked with a bunch of customers that were really bad at describing what kind of problem they had with their computer. So he had to kind of go figure it out on his own. Any sort of SWAT type project, like I need a Swiss Army knife to throw at something, I would walk over to his desk, say, look, I need you to go do X. And he would stay up all night. He was the quintessential stay up all night, drink coffee, Mountain Dew. And in the morning, he would come back just a complete haggard mess, but he would have a solution. And, you know, an ordinary logic would tell you to go hire the guy with a 4-year cyber degree. I was finding my guys that were accountants that were relocating from Ohio. I was finding guys that worked at Geek Squad. The guy that I hired once that was the guy that I've never met anybody that knew DNS, domain name services, better than this guy. He was a janitor at Walmart. And he would clean stores at night, and then he'd sit there at a computer the rest of the night and just learn about computers. I mean, but like just super smart guy.
But that's a rare find.
Totally rare find. I'm not advocating that you need to go to Walmart and hire janitors. But what I'm saying is that look outside the established channels for talent. And there's, I think, a very small percentage of leaders that will take the time to do that, to find that kind of talent.
Well, some don't have the time either.
Correct.
I mean,
Correct.
Yeah, if I could, we're almost out of time. If I could make one more comment, a war story which might fit in. I took over a product. I moved to Fort Worth, Texas, in a factory. We had a product. I was a marketing manager, and the day I arrived, a box of 5,000 pocket knives arrived. And so this is obviously long before TSA was in there, and it had the name of the product, and it said "burned in quality," and they were for giveaways at trade shows. I had the box thrown out. People went crazy. I said, "Do you understand what burned in quality means?" Because what they would do with this product is burn them in they were $1,000 radios. Okay, they burn them in for 48 hours in these giant ovens we have on the factory floor. I said, burned in quality means we have no confidence in our product and we're looking for infant mortality. So who's to say that in the 49th hour or the 50th hour it doesn't fail? So burned in quality is an oxymoron. So no offense, but a large cybersecurity organization doesn't make any sense. Okay, what the transition that Motorola made was to get their development engineers, first their research engineers, the development engineers, to be thinking about quality in the product long before it entered mainstream. And then the next group was the manufacturing people and so forth. So I think the approach is not solving vulnerabilities, is eliminating them at the source. So cybersecurity as a separate discipline doesn't make any sense, like quality is a separate discipline. It's got to be built in by the people doing the fundamental work. So
yeah, I think the real value of cyber is on the incident response piece. It's a SWAT team that you call in when something happens. It's not the proactive scanning, patching service. Like that's IT's job.
right.
Yeah, there's an operation component that belongs in operations.
The real danger, though, I think, is in regards to hiring, experts. If you go back to 2000, when Active Directory first hit the scene, within 2 to 3 years, places like New Horizons, Global Knowledge, etc., were flooded with people going after their MCSE certification.
Yeah.
And I mean, I had guys I put my guys through classes at Global Knowledge because it was cheaper than New Horizons. And they were coming back going, the class is a waste of time. There are truck drivers in there that don't even know what a mouse is.
Yeah.
I'll go study on my own.
Mm.
And, that's what I did. I went and took the 7 tests, whatever it was, in a month, 4-week period and passed.
Yeah.
But that's the flood of the people is now your CISSP certification. That's more like a CPA or a CCIE Cisco, which is hard to get. But there are tons of kids people going after their Security Plus, Network Plus certification bullshit, excuse my language. And they're trying to get into this field, and companies are just willing to hire anybody off the street.
They are.
Yeah.
And you're going to have flaws with that mentality. If you've got people, the best way to do it is find somebody that's got some help desk support and train them up.
Yeah. I remember taking my CISSP exam, and it's a 6-hour exam.
Mhm.
And I mean, I studied for months before that.
6 hours.
6 hours.
That's why you pay
It's-
them.
It's brutal. I mean, I pay my $90 fee every year, even though I mean, I don't really need a CISSP anymore. But just only because I don't ever want to have to take that test again. I'm happy to give you my $90.
Whereas Cisco requires you to recertify every 2 or 3 years.
I think it's 4. The higher certs, I think, are 4.
4. So your CCIP takes 2 days.
Yeah, I mean, it's lab-based. It's
Hands-on lab-based, and at the end of the day, the test people actually come in and mess with your current configurations.
Yeah.
And you have to basically start from scratch and finish the next step. It's rough,
So,
but that's why you walk out with $150,000 plus job.
Well, we're coming to the end of perhaps a little bit longer than an hour. But one of the things I was trying to figure out how to summarize what we say here. It seems to me that you want security to be an integral part of your data. And the closer it is to your data, that security, the more security you could potentially provide, not necessarily provide. And whether it's data or actually a electricity station, substation, the idea is your security has to be as local as possible first before you can build on anything. Is that an accurate statement?
accurate, I would change the word data to operations.
To operations?
Yeah, it's got to be within the operating fabric. So, like the Ukraine example, right? Their security was manual failback, but it was built into the
Right.
fabric of the infrastructure. Same thing for companies. The security has to be built in at the employee level and at the system level. It's not just it's not something that's managed from outside in. It's got to be inside.
And the second part about this is legitimacy seems to be based upon power more than anything else, whether you are legally a hacker, because that word has gone through definition, is depending upon who's got the power to say whether you're legitimate or not.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah.
100%.
So I'd like, Dan, this is fantastic.
Yeah, it was great.
Thank you very
Yeah,
much.
you guys are
And hopefully we'll be able to do this more often in the future as well. So
Sounds great.
thank you.
Thanks, guys.
I like the forum this way. This is
Yeah.
interesting.
Prasad, did you say you sent me somebody?
So my point I was trying to tell, like, friend which I have, like.
He's on mute.
Yes, Jack. He said he tried to join.
I'm
Don't
sorry.
know.
I didn't see
So agent is coming with
the
a new
admit
service,
come up,
which is
so,
basically
and I have to figure out how to
They had
make
a
sure
phone.
that I get a bell or
What they will do,
something.
they will laptop and iPad.
Oh, okay. Okay.
But
Yeah,
I'll try to.
He's in the same area, security area. So just I forwarded him. Yeah, that's fine.
Take
Security
care.
standpoint, they have